This is chapter 35, section 2, which includes 3 pieces of reading. One over the section on the Japanese. The second was what you see here, building the war machine. And the third was about manpower and womanpower with fighting World War II. The section over the Japanese isn't directly tied to World War II, so I don't have any notes over it, but it is something that appeared on your chapter 35, section 2 quiz. So pushing us then forward to the section titled Building the War Machine. This section is specifically about the home front response, specifically the industrial response to the United States declaring war and becoming an active participant in the war. And so when that took place, US factories went into overdrive in the production of weapons of war. And so you see on that first sub bullet point there, how much war machinery the US industry created. So you've got 40 billion bullets, 300,000 aircraft, 76,000 ships, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million machine, that should be guns, there. And so with all of this production focused on what materials of war, the production of non-essential items shrunk. And so we'll see, and we'll talk just a little bit about this, that once the war ends, how that consumer production increases, and you also had people who had money to buy those consumer goods. So we really have a rise of consumerism after World War II. And part of the reason is it's because during the war, that consumer goods industry was suppressed. And what this also means is you have some rationing and things like that taking place within the United States. On top of the weapons of war, farmers are also increasing their output because we are now feeding our troops and also still providing food to other allied powers. And so that is a little bit problematic because farmers in many instances are called into war to go fight in the draft with the draft. And so there's new investments by the government in agricultural technology. So you've got new machinery, improved fertilizers that allow less people, so less farmers, to actually produce more food for the war effort. During this time, labor unions actually grow in size and scope with more people taking on industrial jobs. So it goes from 10 million to 13 million during the war years. And they had some issues with some things done by the government. Specifically, one is that government set up price ceilings, wage ceilings, that factory workers could be paid. And the idea here was, one, to limit inflation. Two, it was to ensure that factories would stay in businesses and provide leverage for factory owners to not to have, I'm trying to think of how to say this, to have limits placed on wages so that unions couldn't demand more than these wage ceilings. So the factory owners could basically say, you know, it's not us who's wanting to not pay you more, it's the government mandated wage ceilings. And so unions obviously resented that. And as a result, there were many walkouts, which did slow industrial production. But ultimately, the textbook points out that the strike rate was lower here in the United States and even places more actively involved in the war, like Britain and the Soviet Union. But in reaction and to prevent these strikes, in 1943, Congress passed the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act, which allowed federal government to seize and operate any industries that were tied up by strikes. So basically the federal government moves in and takes over, and any strikes against these government operated industries were made a criminal offense. So the threat of going to jail was implemented as a means to prevent strikes from taking place. And so that was the first section, or I'm sorry, the second section that you're responsible for reading this week, Building the War Machine. The third section was titled Manpower and Womanpower, obviously in reference to the increased role of women in the job field during World War II. So the armed services did enlist nearly 15 million men. And then also 216,000 women. The women in World War II were in non-combat positions, but women were involved in the war effort. And because you have 15 million men removed from the labor force, many factories brought in women to fill those vacated jobs. And so during World War II, more than 6 million women took up jobs outside their homes. And this obviously led to a dramatic shift in the kind of societal structures that had traditionally been in place during or previous to World War II. And your textbook talked about, you know, the necessity and the rise of childcare and things like that taking place during World War II, because up to this point, kind of the traditional women's role had been in place. However, this mass migration of women to the workforce is temporary to a large degree. At the end of the war, 2/3 of the women left the labor force and returned back to kind of domestic life, as your textbook explains it. But it did show and does play a role in kind of that future shift that takes place of women taking jobs in the workforce. The second slide over that section is just tied to, this is where Rosie the Riveter came to play, and this was used as a piece of propaganda and a symbol of women involved in the American defense industries. And so you can see the very famous poster pictured there. And it was actually based on a real individual who I believe was passed away within the last few years, the actual person that Rosie the Riveter was based on. And then you see a somewhat grainy picture, but of women who are involved in the process of actually riveting. I'm not sure if that's a ship or a fuselage or what that is. And so that concludes chapter 35, section 2.